They laughed at him, the world's bankers, ministers, and professors. Gold is eternal, they said. Gold is civilization itself. But John Maynard Keynes saw something no one else would admit, that gold, this shining metal they worshipped like a deity, was strangling humanity. In 1925, when Britain returned to the gold standard, Keynes begged them to stop. He called it the economic equivalent of self-mutilation. They called him hysterical, a crank, a dangerous dreamer. A few years later, the laughter stopped. Banks fell like dominoes. Empires trembled on their foundations. The streets of London, New York, and Berlin filled with the jobless and the hopeless. And out of that terrible silence, one man's gold theory would rewrite the rules of modern civilization. Picture London in 1913. Horse-drawn carriages clatter over cobblestones still damp from morning fog. Inside the Bank of England, clerks in starched collars stack gold sovereigns with mechanical precision. Each coin catches the gaslight, a small, perfect circle of certainty in an uncertain world. This was the age when gold wasn't just money. It was truth itself. For nearly 2 centuries, the gold standard had been the beating heart of Western civilization. The principle was elegantly simple. Every pound note, every dollar bill, every franc was a promise that you could walk into any bank and exchange that paper for a fixed amount of actual gold. Money wasn't an abstraction. It was real, solid, eternal. The British Empire had built its dominance on this golden foundation. In the City of London, bankers spoke of gold with religious reverence. It was the anchor that kept currencies stable, that made international trade possible, that separated civilized nations from monetary chaos. As good as gold wasn't just an expression. It was economic doctrine. The system worked through iron discipline. If a country's economy overheated, gold would flow out to pay for imports. The money supply would contract. Prices would fall. Wages would drop. The economy would cool. It was automatic, impersonal, beyond the meddling of politicians. Many economists believe this self-correcting mechanism was as natural as the tides and just as unstoppable. At Cambridge University, this orthodoxy was taught as gospel. Classical economics rested on a foundation of elegant mathematical certainty. Say's law declared that supply creates its own demand. Markets always clear. Unemployment is always voluntary. Those without jobs simply haven't accepted the wage rate the market offers. And gold in gold, keeps everything honest. The professors who taught this had the confidence of men explaining gravity. This wasn't politics. This was science. Then came August 1914, and the world discovered that gold couldn't stop bullets. The Great War shattered more than lives. It obliterated the economic certainties of the 19th century. Nations abandoned the gold standard to print money for shells and dreadnoughts. 4 years of mechanized slaughter consumed the accumulated wealth of generations. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, Europe was unrecognizable. The Habsburg Empire had dissolved into squabbling successor states. The German Reich teetered on the edge of revolution. Even victorious Britain was drowning in debt, much of it owed to upstart America, which had emerged from the war as a creditor nation for the first time in its history. And everywhere, the question burned: how do we put the world back together? For Britain's establishment, the answer was obvious. Return to gold. Restore the old order. Bring back the certainty of 1913, when Britannia ruled the waves and sterling was as solid as the throne itself. There was only one problem. The world of 1925 was not the world of 1913, no matter how desperately anyone wished it so. John Maynard Keynes had never been one for worshiping at conventional altars. Born in 1883 to academic parents in Cambridge, He had grown up in an atmosphere of intellectual aristocracy. His father was an economist and logician. His mother would become the city's first female mayor. Young Maynard learned early that the life of the mind was the highest calling, and that challenging orthodoxy wasn't just acceptable, it was obligatory. At Eton and then King's College, Cambridge, Keynes had been brilliant in that particularly English way. Equally at home discussing probability theory, collecting rare books, or devastating an opponent's argument with a perfectly timed quip, he moved in the Cambridge Apostles, that secret society of intellectual elites who believed they were too clever for conventional morality. But it was his work during the war that had transformed him from a brilliant academic into something more dangerous. A man with actual power who had seen behind the curtain. As a Treasury official, Keynes had been instrumental in financing Britain's war effort. He understood how money really worked, not the fairy tales in textbooks, but the messy reality of credit, debt, and political expedience. He had watched nations abandon gold the moment it became inconvenient. He had seen how quickly eternal principles evaporated when survival was at stake. Then came Versailles. In 1919, Keynes had joined the British delegation to the Paris Peace Conference as a financial expert. What he witnessed there appalled him. The victorious powers, particularly France, were determined to extract crushing reparations from Germany, sums so vast they defied economic reality. Keynes argued frantically that this would doom Europe to perpetual instability. Germany couldn't pay. The attempt would destroy German democracy and poison international relations for generations. Nobody listened. In June 1919, Keynes resigned in protest. He returned to Cambridge and, in a white heat of fury and despair, wrote, "The Economic Consequences of the Peace," a devastating critique of the treaty that became an international sensation. He had predicted disaster, and now the establishment couldn't forgive him for it, especially because, month by month, his predictions were coming true. By 1925, Britain faced a choice. The pound had been floating freely since the war, its value determined by supply and demand in currency markets. This made traditionalists deeply uncomfortable. A floating currency felt improper, almost indecent, like money without clothes on. Winston Churchill, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, was determined to restore Britain's monetary honor. Return the pound to its pre-war gold parity, £3, 17 seconds, 10.0 per ounce of gold, the same rate that had prevailed since 1717. Show the world that Britain was still Britain, that the war had changed nothing essential. The symbolism was intoxicating. The economics were catastrophic. Keynes tried to stop it. He published pamphlets, wrote letters, argued with anyone who would listen. The problem was simple arithmetic. During the war, prices in Britain had risen faster than in America. If Britain now fixed the pound at the old gold rate, British goods would suddenly become expensive in foreign markets. Exports would collapse. Unemployment would soar. The country would be locked into deflation, falling prices, falling wages, falling hopes. The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, Keynes titled his devastating pamphlet. He wasn't kind. He accused Churchill of choosing sentiment over sense, of sacrificing British workers on the altar of monetary nostalgia. Churchill, who prided himself on his rhetorical prowess, was furious. The Treasury was dismissive. The Governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, was icily contemptuous. Who was this Cambridge academic to question the accumulated wisdom of the City of London? In April 1925, Britain returned to the gold standard at the pre-war rate. Keynes had been right about everything, and nobody thanked him for it. The effects were immediate and brutal. British coal, textiles, and steel suddenly cost more in foreign markets. Orders dried up. Factories cut production. Workers were laid off by the thousands. In May 1926, the nation erupted in the general strike. Millions of workers walked out, protesting wage cuts demanded by mine owners who could no longer compete internationally. For 9 days, Britain teetered on the edge of class warfare. Buses stopped running. Newspapers ceased publication. The government recruited volunteers to keep essential services functioning. The strike failed. The miners were starved back to work, their wages slashed. This was the iron logic of gold at work. The economy must adjust to the currency, not the currency to the economy. Workers must accept lower wages. Businesses must accept lower profits. If this causes suffering, well, that's the price of monetary virtue. Keynes watched it all with mounting horror and rage. This wasn't economics. This was human sacrifice disguised as mathematical necessity. He began to ask a question that seemed almost blasphemous to his peers. What if the classical economists were wrong? Not just mistaken about details, but fundamentally wrong about how economies work. What if markets don't always clear? What if unemployment isn't voluntary? What if saving can be a vice and spending a virtue? What if the whole elegant theoretical edifice was built on foundations of sand? What if gold, that barbarous relic, as he would come to call it, wasn't the solution to economic instability, but its cause? These questions would make him the most dangerous economist in the world. Keynes's Cambridge office overlooked the ancient courtyard of King's College, where students in black gowns hurried between lectures. But his intellectual home was elsewhere in the bohemian drawing rooms of Bloomsbury, where artists, writers, and freethinkers gathered to remake civilization. The Bloomsbury group believed passionately in beauty, truth, and personal relationships. They rejected Victorian morality as hypocritical nonsense. They experimented with art, sexuality, and ideas with equal enthusiasm. Virginia Woolf captured their ethos. Let us think what we like of what we like. For Keynes, Bloomsbury was liberation. Here, questioning orthodoxy wasn't just acceptable, it was required. His lover, Duncan Grant, was a painter. His friends included E.M. Forster, Lytton Strachey, and Roger Fry. They taught him that intellectual courage meant following arguments wherever they led, regardless of what the respectable world thought. This mattered because what Keynes was beginning to think would scandalize the respectable world. Classical economics rested on a comforting foundation. Markets are self-correcting. If workers are unemployed, wages will fall until employers hire them. If goods don't sell, prices will drop until buyers appear. The invisible hand ensures that every resource finds its most productive use. Government intervention only gums up the works. But Keynes kept encountering inconvenient facts that didn't fit the theory. Britain had been in economic doldrums since returning to gold. Unemployment hovered around 10%, not temporarily, but persistently, year after grinding year. Classical theory said this was impossible. If workers really wanted jobs, they'd accept lower wages. The fact that unemployment persisted meant workers were being irrational, holding out for wages above their market value. But Keynes had eyes. He'd seen the dole queues. He'd watched skilled craftsmen desperate for any work at any wage. These weren't lazy shirkers making rational calculations. These were men whose skills and willingness to work were being wasted because the entire system had seized up. The problem, he began to realize, wasn't wages, it was demand. When businesses aren't selling goods, they don't hire workers no matter how low wages fall. When workers lose jobs, they stop buying goods, creating a vicious cycle. An economy can get stuck in equilibrium at high unemployment. Everyone rational, but everyone suffering. And gold made it worse. The gold standard meant the money supply was fixed by the amount of metal in bank vaults. If the economy needed more money to facilitate transactions, Too bad. Gold was gold. You couldn't conjure more into existence just because factories were idle and workers were desperate. What if, Keynes began to wonder, the government could step in? Not to replace markets, but to supplement them. If businesses won't invest and consumers can't spend, what if government spending could restart the cycle? This was heresy of the highest order. While Keynes was developing his heterodox ideas, the prophecy he'd made at Versailles was coming true in the most horrifying way imaginable. Germany, crushed under the weight of reparations, spiraled into hyperinflation. By 1923, prices doubled every few days. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily so they could buy food before their wages became worthless. People carted wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy bread. The Reichsmark, once a proud currency backed by gold, became worth less than the paper it was printed on. The social effects were catastrophic. Middle-class families saw their life savings evaporate. Pensioners starved. The educated classes who had believed in rules and order and the sanctity of money discovered that the system could betray them utterly. This trauma would have consequences nobody could yet imagine. But Keynes saw the writing on the wall. He had warned them. He had told them Versailles was not just unjust, but economically impossible. And they had called him soft on Germany, naive, unpatriotic. Now the German democracy was teetering, and dark forces were gathering in the beer halls of Munich. In 1930, Keynes published A Treatise on Money, 2 dense volumes attempting to explain how modern monetary economies actually work, as opposed to how classical theory said they should work. The book was ambitious, brilliant, and Keynes himself later admitted not quite right. He was groping toward a revolutionary insight, but hadn't yet fully grasped it. The treatise was transitional work. The thinking of a man who knew the old system was wrong but hadn't yet completely formulated the new one. Still, it contained explosive ideas. Keynes argued that saving and investment weren't automatically equal, as classical theory insisted. Sometimes people want to save more than businesses want to invest. The excess saving doesn't just disappear. It translates into unsold goods, layoffs, and economic contraction. The policy implication was radical. Sometimes the government needs to do the spending that private actors won't. Not permanently. Not in place of markets. But as a counterweight. When the economic cycle swings toward depression, orthodox economists were horrified. This was precisely the kind of government meddling that classical theory warned against. Markets know best. Politicians are fools or knaves. Government spending would crowd out private investment and make things worse. Keynes argued that you can't crowd out private investment that isn't happening anyway. When factories are idle and workers are jobless, government spending doesn't steal resources from productive uses. It puts idle resources back to work. But the debate remained academic, theoretical, a dispute among professors that wouldn't affect real policy. Then the world fell off a cliff. The 24th of October, 1929. Wall Street. The New York Stock Exchange opened to immediate chaos. Everyone was selling. No one was buying. Prices plunged so fast the ticker tape couldn't keep up, running hours behind the actual carnage on the trading floor. By midday, panic had turned to terror. Crowds gathered outside the exchange, watching in stunned disbelief as fortunes evaporated. Bankers huddled in emergency meetings, trying to halt the collapse. For a moment, it seemed to work. Major banks pooled resources to buy stocks and stabilize prices. But it was only delaying the inevitable. The following Tuesday, October 29, forever after known as Black Tuesday, the bottom fell out completely. 16 million shares traded hands in a single day, a record that seemed impossible. The ticker tape ran 4 hours late. By closing bell, $30 billion in market value had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. The Roaring Twenties were over. The Great Depression had begun. What happened next defied classical economic theory and proved Keynes's worst fears. The stock market crash was bad. But crashes happen. Markets correct. In previous panics, the economy had recovered within a year or two. This time was different. This time, the crash triggered a global banking crisis. And the global banking crisis was made catastrophic by the gold standard. Here's what happened. As stock prices fell, investors panicked and withdrew their money from banks. As deposits fled, banks called in loans. As loans were called in, businesses failed. As businesses failed, workers lost jobs. As workers lost jobs, they couldn't pay their mortgages or debts. As debts went unpaid, more banks failed. It was a death spiral, and gold made it inescapable. Under the gold standard, each country's money supply was tied to its gold reserves. When depositors withdrew gold from banks, the money supply contracted. Central banks, following gold standard orthodoxy, raised interest rates to protect their gold reserves, making borrowing more expensive precisely when businesses needed credit most. Classical theory said this would quickly restore equilibrium. Prices would fall. Wages would fall. Eventually, goods would be cheap enough and labor inexpensive enough that businesses would start hiring again. Markets would clear, but markets weren't clearing. They were collapsing. By 1931, unemployment in the United States had reached 15% and was climbing. In Germany, it hit 25%. In Britain, it hovered around 20%. And these weren't just statistics, they were human beings. Skilled workers who wanted to work, who begged for work, and who found nothing. Yet central bankers clung to gold standard orthodoxy, like drowning men clinging to an anchor. Sarah Mitchell had worked at the textile mill in Manchester since she was 14. She was 32 now with 3 children and a husband who'd been laid off from the shipyard. Her job was the only thing keeping them from the workhouse. Then the mill closed. Orders from America had dried up. The firm couldn't compete with cheaper imports. 60 women lost their jobs in a single afternoon. Sarah stood in the dole queue for 3 hours, clutching the youngest child, little Tommy, just 2 years old, coughing with a cold they couldn't afford to treat properly. The clerk barely looked at her as he calculated her benefits. 7 shillings a week for a family of 5. Her husband, Jim, had stopped looking for work. What was the point? Every job posting had 200 applicants. Men with engineering degrees were competing for positions as street sweepers. Pride dies slowly, but it dies. Stories like this multiplied across the industrial world. In America, tent cities sprouted in public parks. Hoovervilles, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, who insisted prosperity was just around the corner. In Germany, the jobless organized into paramilitary groups, some communist, some fascist. All desperate and angry. Farmers destroyed crops because prices had fallen below the cost of harvesting. Children went to bed hungry, while wheat rotted in fields. Not because there wasn't enough food, but because people couldn't afford to buy it. The classical economists had an explanation. This was the market clearing. Prices were adjusting. Wages were adjusting. The pain was necessary. Be patient. Have faith in gold. But how patient can you be when your children are hungry? In his Cambridge study, surrounded by rare books and economic treatises, Keynes wrote with barely controlled rage. He had warned them. He had told them the gold standard would turn a recession into a catastrophe. He had explained that market clearing theory assumed away the very problem it was supposed to solve. And they had ignored him, dismissed him, called him a crank. Now the bodies were piling up, not literally, not yet, but the social fabric was tearing. Democracy itself was under threat. In Germany, a failed Austrian painter named Adolf Hitler was gathering followers by promising to restore national pride and destroy the economic system that had betrayed them. Keynes poured his fury into articles, pamphlets, and lectures. The world will not much longer tolerate the unemployment which is associated with capitalism, he wrote. But it may be possible by a right analysis of the problem to cure the disease whilst preserving efficiency and freedom. The problem, he argued with increasing clarity, was that classical economics had gotten the causation backwards. It wasn't that wages needed to fall to restore employment. It was that income needed to rise to restore demand. What good is a low wage if you don't have a job? It was a system that could get stuck in low gear, with everyone acting rationally but everyone suffering. And when that happened, someone had to step on the gas. That someone was government. But the establishment wasn't listening. They had their own explanations for the Depression, and those explanations conveniently absolved them of responsibility. It was the fault of speculators and greedy investors. It was the fault of workers who wouldn't accept realistic wages. It was the fault of politicians who had abandoned sound finance during the war. It was the fault of anything and everything except the gold standard and classical economic theory. The Bank of England raised interest rates to defend the pound's gold parity, even as unemployment soared. The U.S. Federal Reserve allowed the money supply to collapse by a third, even as banks failed by the thousands. The German government imposed brutal austerity to maintain its currency's value, even as the Weimar Republic crumbled. And when Keynes argued for government spending to restart the economy, they had a word for people like him: socialist, dangerous, irresponsible. Never mind that he wasn't advocating socialism, he was trying to save capitalism from itself. The Treasury view, as it came to be known, held that government spending couldn't reduce unemployment because it would simply crowd out private spending. If the government borrowed money to hire workers, that was money businesses couldn't borrow to hire workers. You couldn't conjure prosperity out of nothing. Keynes, exasperated, pointed out the obvious flaw. When unemployment is 20%, there is no private spending to crowd out. The resources are sitting idle. Workers want to work. Factories want to produce. But the circular flow has broken down, and someone needs to restart it. Pyramid building, earthquakes, even wars may serve to increase wealth. He wrote provocatively, if the education of our statesmen on the principles of classical economics stands in the way of something better. They called him mad. But in the shanty towns and dole queues, people were starting to wonder if the madness was elsewhere. September 1931. Britain faced a crisis. The pound was under attack in foreign exchange markets. Investors, fearing Britain couldn't maintain the gold standard, were converting pounds to gold and shipping it abroad. Orthodox policy was clear. Raise interest rates, cut government spending, defend the gold parity at all costs, show the markets that Britain still stood for sound money. But the cost was becoming not impossible to bear. Unemployment was approaching 3 million. The government had already cut unemployment benefits and public sector wages. How much more austerity could a democracy endure? On the 21st of September 1931, the British government made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. They abandoned the gold standard. The pound floated freely. The chains were broken, and Keynes, vindicated at last, prepared to explain why this wasn't a disaster, but an opportunity, if only anyone was ready to listen. When Britain left the gold standard, the establishment predicted apocalypse. Without gold to anchor it, surely the pound would collapse. Inflation would explode. The economy would descend into chaos. This was what happened when you abandoned sound money principles. None of it happened. Instead, something remarkable occurred. The pound fell about 25% against gold-backed currencies, making British exports competitive again. Interest rates dropped, making gold borrowing cheaper. The vice that had been crushing the British economy for 6 years suddenly loosened. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't immediate. But month by month, things got marginally better instead of progressively worse. Unemployment stopped rising. Some factories reopened. The sense of terminal crisis lifted slightly. Keynes seized the moment. "We have at last a free hand to do what is sensible," he wrote. But what, exactly, was sensible? Between 1931 and 1936, Keynes worked on his masterpiece, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. It would be the most influential economics book of the 20th century, though almost nobody could understand it on first reading. The prose was dense, the mathematics opaque, the arguments elliptical. Even sympathetic readers found it frustrating. But beneath the difficult surface was a revolutionary core that would transform economics forever. Classical theory, Keynes argued, was a special case, applicable only in very specific circumstances that rarely existed in the real world. It assumed full employment, perfect competition, and instant market clearing. In that imaginary world, government intervention was indeed unnecessary. But the real world was different. Markets could get stuck. Unemployment could persist. And when that happened, waiting for automatic adjustment meant waiting for catastrophe. The key insight was about demand. Classical economists believed supply created its own demand. If you produce goods, you generate income, and that income gets spent. Say's law, they called it. It had to be true. But Keynes showed it wasn't. When businesses expect weak demand, they cut investment. When workers lose jobs, they cut spending. When people feel insecure, they save rather than spend. These are all individually rational decisions. But collectively, they create a vicious cycle where lack of demand becomes self-fulfilling. The economy could settle into equilibrium. At high unemployment, everyone acting rationally, markets clearing at the wrong level, and no automatic mechanism to fix it. The solution? Someone had to break the cycle by spending when others wouldn't. And the only actor large enough, and with the right incentives, was government. Not permanent government control of the economy. Not socialism. Just strategic, temporary intervention to restart the circulation of money when it seized up, like a doctor restarting a stopped heart. But ideas don't win just by being right. They have to overcome entrenched interests, institutional inertia, and the fundamental conservatism of the powerful. The Treasury establishment hated Keynesian ideas. Government spending meant debt, and debt meant fiscal irresponsibility. They'd spent the 1,920 seconds trying to balance the budget and restore pre-war financial rectitude. Keynes was telling them all that effort had been counterproductive. The Bank of England was even more hostile. Central bankers were high priests of monetary orthodoxy. They understood gold, interest rates, and reserve ratios. This new theory about aggregate demand and multiplier effects seemed like dangerous mysticism. And in the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt was trying something unprecedented, the New Deal, that seemed to embody Keynesian principles, even though Roosevelt himself didn't really understand the theory. FDR was a pragmatist, not an economist. When he took office in 1933, the banking system had collapsed completely. Unemployment was approaching 25%. American democracy itself seemed at risk. He tried everything: infrastructure programs, agricultural subsidies, banking reform, industrial codes. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting forests. The Works Progress Administration built roads, bridges, schools, and post offices across America. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to millions. It was the largest government jobs program in American history. Orthodox. Economists were appalled. This was exactly the kind of boondoggle that would bankrupt the nation. Government couldn't create real wealth. It could only redistribute it. The New Deal would fail, and when it did, Americans would return to economic sanity. But it didn't fail. Slowly, painfully, the economy began to recover. Meanwhile, in Cambridge and London, Keynes was fighting a different war for the minds of economists. His opponents weren't stupid. They were brilliant men who had spent lifetimes mastering classical theory. They couldn't simply abandon everything they believed without overwhelming proof. Professor A.C. Pigou at Cambridge was perhaps the most formidable. He represented the old Cambridge tradition. Mathematical rigor, moral seriousness, unwavering faith in market mechanisms. Pigou argued that unemployment existed only because workers demanded wages above their marginal productivity. Lower wages would solve everything. Keynes, with barely concealed contempt, called this the most extraordinary delusion in all of economics. Lower wages meant lower demand, which meant more unemployment, which meant even lower wages. You couldn't cure unemployment by making people poorer. But changing minds required more than better arguments. It required creating a new generation of economists who thought differently from the start. This was Keynes's secret weapon. His students. At Cambridge, brilliant young economists like Joan Robinson, Richard Kahn, and Austin Robinson formed what came to be called the Cambridge Circus, a group dedicated to clarifying and extending Keynesian theory. They met weekly, dissecting his drafts, arguing about concepts, working out the mathematics. Joan Robinson was particularly important. Tough-minded and fearless, she became one of Keynesian theory's most effective advocates. Her book, Introduction to the Theory of Employment, made Keynes's dense prose accessible to students. She toured universities, debating classical, economists, and usually winning. In America, young economists like Paul Samuelson, James Tobin, and Robert Solow absorbed Keynesian ideas in graduate school. They would spend the next decades developing, refining, and mathematically formalizing what came to be called the neoclassical synthesis, a merger of Keynesian macroeconomics with classical microeconomics. By the late 1930s, the intellectual landscape was shifting. Keynesian ideas were still controversial, but they were no longer fringe. The establishment couldn't simply dismiss them as the ravings of a crank, especially because the evidence kept supporting Keynes's predictions. Throughout the 1930s, different countries tried different approaches to the Depression. It was like a vast, terrible experiment in economic policy. Countries that clung to gold and balanced budgets, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, suffered the longest and most severe depressions. Their economies remained mired in unemployment and stagnation until the very end of the decade. Countries that abandoned gold and tried expansionary policies, Britain, Sweden, the United States, recovered faster. Not quickly, not painlessly, but they at least had economies that were growing again. Germany recovered fastest of all, but through a method that terrified Keynes: massive military rearmament financed by deficit spending. The Nazis had stumbled onto a perverted version of Keynesian stimulus. They were proving that government spending could eliminate unemployment. They just planned to use their full employment economy to conquer Europe. This crystallized something for Keynes. His theory wasn't just about economic efficiency, it was about saving democracy. If democratic governments couldn't solve unemployment, people would turn to fascism or communism. The stakes weren't just material prosperity. They were civilization itself. By the late 1930s, the intellectual debate was reaching a climax. Classical economists, seeing their predictions repeatedly falsified, fell back on a final argument. Yes, Keynesian policies might work in the short run, but in the long run, they would cause inflation, debt crises, and economic decay. Keynes's response became his most famous quote, "In the long run, we are all dead." End quote. He wasn't being flippant. He was making a profound point about economic method. Economists had to address the problems of today. You couldn't tell unemployed workers to be patient, while automatic adjustment mechanisms eventually worked. You couldn't sacrifice a generation to abstract theory. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task. He wrote, "If in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us that when the storm is long past the ocean is flat again." The storm was still raging, and Keynes had shown how to navigate it. Ironically, it took another catastrophe to fully vindicate Keynesian economics: World War II. When war broke out in September 1939, Britain faced an economic problem that seemed impossible. How could a nation already strained by depression suddenly produce enough weapons, ships, planes, and supplies to fight Nazi Germany? Classical economics said it couldn't be done without massive inflation. The economy was already at full employment, or close to it. You couldn't just conjure more production out of thin air. If the government tried to spend its way to rearmament, prices would explode. Keynes showed them how to do it. In a pamphlet called How to Pay for the War, he outlined a comprehensive plan for war finance based on his theories. The key was managing demand. If the government was going to spend massively on weapons, civilian demand had to be suppressed through taxes, forced saving, and rationing. But if managed correctly, the economy could expand production far beyond what peacetime economists thought possible. It worked spectacularly. Britain mobilized resources that had been idle or underutilized during the Depression years. Unemployment virtually disappeared. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers. The economy that couldn't produce enough in the 1930 seconds was suddenly churning out Spitfires, tanks, and Liberty ships. And the United States repeated the performance on an even larger scale. American war production was staggering more planes, ships, and weapons than all other combatants combined. The economy that had languished in depression for a decade suddenly discovered it could produce more than anyone had imagined possible. Keynesian economics wasn't just theory anymore. It was the blueprint for victory. As the war drew toward its conclusion, Keynes faced one final challenge: designing the post-war international economic order. He was determined that the mistakes of the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds wouldn't be repeated. No return to the gold standard, no crushing reparations, no automatic mechanisms that sacrificed human welfare to abstract principles. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to negotiate the new system. Keynes led the British delegation despite declining health. His counterpart, Harry Dexter White from the U.S. Treasury, represented American interests. It was a battle between a fading empire and a rising superpower, fought with exchange rate mechanisms and liquidity provisions instead of weapons. The Americans had the money and therefore the power, but Keynes had the ideas. The compromise they reached created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Exchange rates would be fixed, but adjustable stability without rigidity. Countries facing balance of payments problems would get temporary assistance rather than being forced into brutal austerity. It was gold standard discipline without gold standard cruelty. Keynes wanted to go further. He proposed an international currency called Bancor and automatic mechanisms to pressure surplus countries, like the U.S., to spend rather than hoard gold. The Americans rejected these provisions, but even the compromise system represented a revolution in economic thinking. For the first time, the international community had agreed that managing the global economy wasn't about automatic mechanisms and metallic discipline. It was about human decisions, collective action, and the conscious pursuit of prosperity. Keynes returned to Britain, exhausted but cautiously triumphant. He had spent decades fighting for this moment, for recognition that economics was a tool to serve human welfare, not an iron cage constraining human possibility. But victory had come at a price. Keynes's health, never robust, had deteriorated sharply during the war years. The stress of constant negotiation, transatlantic travel, and intellectual combat had worn him down. He suffered a severe heart attack in 1937, from which he never fully recovered. His doctors ordered rest. Instead, he threw himself into war work with even greater intensity. There was too much at stake. If he didn't fight for these ideas, who would? His friends in Bloomsbury watched with concern as he drove himself relentlessly. Virginia Woolf, before her own tragic death in 1941, had written to him, "You are the only economist who ever made me laugh." But there was little laughter now. In his private letters, Keynes expressed a mixture of satisfaction and disillusionment. His ideas were winning, but often implemented poorly or for the wrong reasons. Politicians who had no understanding of his theories claimed to be following them while doing the opposite. And he was under no illusions about permanence. Ideas, he knew, had their season. The orthodoxy he had overthrown had once seemed eternal too. Someday, perhaps, new problems would require new thinking, and his own theories would become the obstacle to progress. Practical men, who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences, he had written years before, are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Would he someday be the defunct economist enslaving a future generation? Keynes died on the 21st of April 1946 at his country home in Sussex. He was 62 years old. He didn't live to see the full flowering of the economic order he had helped create, but the seeds were planted. The post-war decades would become known as the Golden Age of capitalism, a period of unprecedented prosperity, low unemployment, and rising living standards across the Western world. It wasn't perfect. There were still recessions, still inequalities, still policy mistakes. But the catastrophic mass unemployment of the 1,930 seconds didn't return. When economies slowed, governments didn't stand aside waiting for automatic adjustment. They acted. The consensus that emerged, sometimes called Keynesian economics, though Keynes himself would have found much of it oversimplified, held that government had both the capacity and the responsibility to manage aggregate demand, not to replace markets, but to stabilize them, to lean against the wind, spending more during recessions and less during booms. For 3 decades, it worked remarkably well. The generation of economists Keynes had trained carried his ideas forward, refining and extending them. Paul Samuelson's textbook Economics introduced millions of students to Keynesian thinking. James Tobin developed the theory of portfolio selection. Robert Solow modeled long-run economic growth. They didn't agree on everything. Keynesian economics fragmented into various schools: neo-Keynesians, post-Keynesians, new Keynesians. Academic debates raged about the details. But the core insight remained. Markets alone couldn't guarantee full employment. Politicians embraced Keynesian policies, though often imperfectly. President Kennedy's economic advisors were explicit Keynesians who advocated tax cuts to stimulate demand during the 1961 recession. President Johnson's war on poverty was justified partly in Keynesian terms. Helping the poor would also help the economy by increasing demand. Even Richard Nixon, a Republican who despised big government, declared, "We are all Keynesians now," in 1971. But ideological victory contains the seeds of complacency. And complacency makes you vulnerable to the next crisis. By the 1970s, cracks were showing in the Keynesian consensus. The economic problems of that decade, simultaneous inflation and unemployment, stagflation as it came to be called, didn't fit neatly into Keynesian frameworks. If the problem was insufficient demand, why was inflation rising? If the problem was excess demand causing inflation, why was unemployment also rising? Something wasn't working. A new generation of economists, led by Milton Friedman and the Chicago School, offered a different explanation. The problem wasn't that Keynesian theory was wrong exactly. It was that politicians had learned the wrong lesson. Keynes had advocated counter-cyclical policy spend during recessions, save during booms. But politicians loved the spending part and hated the saving part. They ran deficits during recessions and ran deficits during booms. The result was chronic inflation and distorted expectations. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, Friedman declared. Control the money supply and you'd control inflation. Government spending couldn't create real prosperity, only nominal dollar amounts that would be eaten away by rising prices. It was a sophisticated critique. And it resonated with a public frustrated by economic stagnation and rising prices. The intellectual pendulum began swinging back toward free markets and away from government intervention. In 1979, Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve and deliberately triggered a severe recession to break inflation. Unemployment soared above 10%. It was brutal, but, according to Volcker's defenders, necessary. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, he brought with him an explicit rejection of Keynesian demand management. "Government is not the solution to our problem," Reagan declared. "Government is the problem." The Keynesian era seemed to be ending. What's remarkable about the late 20th century isn't that Keynesian economics faced challenges. Every theory does. What's remarkable is how quickly supposedly discredited ideas returned. By the 1992, central banks had quietly adopted a sophisticated version of Keynesian demand management, though they didn't call it that. Instead of government spending, they manipulated interest rates to stimulate or cool the economy. Lower rates during recessions, higher rates during booms. It was Keynesian counter-cyclical policy by another name. But the faith in self-correcting markets had returned. Financial deregulation accelerated. The assumption was that sophisticated traders and mathematical models had tamed risk. Government oversight was for a more primitive era. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis began with obscure mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps, but it metastasized into something terrifyingly familiar, a full-scale banking panic followed by economic collapse. Lehman Brothers failed. Credit markets froze. Stock markets crashed. Unemployment began rising rapidly. Suddenly, the catastrophes of the 1930s didn't seem so distant, and suddenly, everyone was Keynesian again. The U.S. government, under both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, implemented massive stimulus programs. The Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to zero and began buying government bonds to inject money into the economy. Europe initially tried austerity, watched their economies collapse, and then quietly reversed course. It was 2008, not 1932. But the playbook was Keynesian. Conservative economists who had spent decades attacking government intervention suddenly discovered that, yes, in extraordinary circumstances, perhaps the government should prevent total economic collapse. They just insisted these were truly extraordinary circumstances that would never happen again. But they had said that after the Depression, too. Today, the debate Keynes started continues. It shapes arguments about climate policy, inequality, cryptocurrency, and pandemic response. When COVID-19 shut down the global economy in 2020, governments implemented Keynesian policies on a scale that would have shocked even Keynes himself. Trillions in stimulus spending, direct payments to citizens, massive expansion of unemployment benefits. The alternative, letting markets clear naturally through mass unemployment and business failures, was politically unthinkable. But immediately, the old arguments returned. Was this necessary or excessive? Would it cause inflation? Was government debt sustainable? Should we worry about moral hazard and people becoming dependent on government support? These are legitimate questions. But beneath them runs the deeper debate that Keynes never resolved, because it can't be resolved. What is an economy for? Is it a machine that must be kept running according to certain rules even if people suffer? Or is it a tool that should serve human welfare, even if that requires bending the rules? Is money a sacred trust? A store of value that must be protected at all costs? Or is it a social convention, a medium of exchange that has value only insofar as it facilitates human flourishing? Here's the strange thing. The gold standard Keynes fought against is gone. No major currency has been backed by gold since the 1972. You can't walk into the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve and demand gold for your paper money. And yet the mentality persists. Every few years, someone proposes returning to gold. Not because of any economic argument the practical problems are insurmountable, but because gold represents certainty, discipline, sound money. It represents economics as natural law, rather than human choice. The cryptocurrency movement is, in many ways, digital gold, standardism. Bitcoin's fixed supply mimics gold's scarcity. Advocates praise it for being beyond government control, immune to debasement. The language is eerily similar to 1922's gold bugs. And when inflation rises, even mainstream economists start making arguments that sound suspiciously like those Keynes fought. Government spending causes inflation. Central banks must maintain credibility. Discipline, austerity, automatic mechanisms. The ghost of the gold standard haunts us still. Keynes's core insight wasn't really about economics. It was about the relationship between abstract principles and human reality.